Welcome to Stars and Swords. I'm Alistair Stevens. This week we continue our discussion of Terry Pratchett's fourth Discworld novel, Mort. And to celebrate, two things. Firstly, I am drinking this evening, if I can hold this up to my camera, a little Mortini. It's just a pun, just a friendly pun here amongst friends. And the other thing is that I have not set up my lighting properly here in the studio tonight, so I do rather look like a video blogger from like the mid-2010s. I'm feeling very, early John and Hank Green kind of vibes just with this setup and the shallow depth of field behind me. So forgive me if I wander off topic more than usual tonight and, start some frantic YouTube-style cutting that might just happen to stitch together the rambling and incoherent thoughts that I normally spill forth here on the podcast into something just a little bit more tight, a little bit more put together. Last time, we were introduced to our title character, to Mort himself, our reluctant hero. We sketched his supporting cast. We introduced the figure of Death himself. At least if this is your first Discworld book, we introduced him. And if this is your fourth Discworld book, we kind of tweaked him. We kind of adjusted him. He became the figure that he was always intended to be. We introduced Death's housekeeper, Albert, his adopted daughter, Ysabelle. Death takes Mort out on the job, the duty. And Mort witnesses the assassination of the king of Stolat. He also, importantly for tonight's reading, is distracted by the princess of Stolat. More on her later. This week, we are going to see the story really takes shape, and the story is going to take shape a little later than we had perhaps planned, a little later than we might expect, given the generally robust approach that Pratchett takes to his plotting, although, again, this is the fourth Discworld novel, so he is not quite yet as sharp as he will become in the years following this particular book and this publication. The other thing, I hesitated there because I wanted to remind myself that the other thing that I wanted to bring up tonight that I mentioned in passing in our last episode was the disharmonious, the discontinuous way that Pratchett will break his own fictional world for a joke. These little throwaway references. He will allude to something that exists in our shared modern world rather than in the disc in order to provide a punchline, in order to provide a useful point of comparison. I described that in our last episode as being a very Douglas Adams-like inclination, which of course sits more harmoniously in the work of Douglas Adams because he is a science fiction writer. So he can still draw upon Earth because Earth still exists within the frame of his broader narrative. That's not true for Pratchett. So it is a little weird in this book when he continually, much to my surprise, I must admit, continually breaks the fictional frame in order to make exactly this kind of reference. There's a reference to motorways. There are innumerable references to modern devices and modern experiences which don't quite connect with the disc. He will stop doing that shortly after this book. I don't remember there being any of those in Weird Sisters, though. Admittedly, I didn't remember there being any of those here in the pages of Mort either, so my memory might just be faulty when it comes to this particular quality of Pratchett's writing, but we will discuss that, I'm sure, as we move forward through his collected work. Hugh is saying here that I felt that Douglas Adams was a great influence. Yes, I mean, there is such commonality between the two that, at least when I was growing up, as I was coming to Pratchett, I guess on my own in the very late 1980s, around the age of 10, 11, I think I started reading, possibly my first book was Strata, which might explain why I am warmer on that book than the others. Oh no, I think that my first was actually The Color of Magic, but I remember kind of finding my way through Pratchett's work at the same time as I was discovering Adams' work, and then becoming aware in my teenage years that there were polarized sides to that battle. There were opinions had been taken, opinions had been expressed, and battle lines had certainly been drawn. For what it's worth, as I said last time, I think that Pratchett is a better stylist than Adams. Pratchett is, line by line, sentence by sentence, a better writer than Adams was. He's also has the first mover position of being so much more prolific, like incredibly more prolific than Adams was during his career. So he has that advantage too, which is to take nothing away from Adams and his remarkable facility with mining the absurd. I think that is perhaps, as we'll discuss tonight, in fact, because Pratchett is going to position this book very carefully in a realm of, well, what? Because it's not quite magical realism. It's kind of the opposite of magical realism, right? It's this naturalist fantasy is what we're going to get as we move through the pages of Mort. We'll talk specifically about how that is evident in the book as we move through tonight's reading, but it separates Pratchett. It distinguishes Pratchett from that Adam's instinct to mine the absurd as fully and completely and as joyously, as anarchically as possible. I think that there is clear blue air between the two of them, right? They are very identifiable within this very similar field. Though you're right, if you zoom out and you look at all of comic fantasy, if you zoom out and you look at all of fantasy and science fiction, all of speculative fiction, then they are very, very, very close to one another, very tightly knitted there. Hugh is asking which came first. I believe that Adams is younger than Pratchett, was 4 years younger than Pratchett, I believe. And Pratchett certainly got a head start. He published first, but Adams was on the treadmill. Adams had his connections through Cambridge. So as Pratchett is spending the 1970s, remember, he publishes The Carpet People in 1971. So he is working for over a decade before he hits real commercial success, and certainly a decade and a half before he dedicates himself to writing full time. Adams is already working for the BBC by the time he graduates university, in effect, right? He's already working with the Monty Python guys. He's already publishing his own work because he has this prestige of the Oxbridge education, don't you know? We're actually going to talk about that a little later too, because I think that one of the ways in which we might understand Pratchett's humanism, one of the ways in which we might understand how Pratchett develops these large casts of characters, not just in each individual novel, but across the span of the Discworld novels as a whole, he manages to maintain and connect with these people with an enormous empathy. And I'm going to try to at least draw this distinction here between I don't want to be too critical of Adam's style. I think it is fair to say, honestly, that Adams has a pretty deep contempt for most, if not all, of his characters, right? That is the root of a lot of, particularly the Hitchhiker's comedy. Dirk Gently works a little differently. There are some different preoccupations at play there. And obviously, I think, too, the contempt level does fall off as we move through the increasingly inaccurately named Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy trilogy, right? But there's rarely a trace of that sense of contempt in Pratchett's work, even when he's back writing the first two Discworld novels, even when he's satirizing Lieber and Vance and the great pulp fantasy and science fiction writers, even when it is an expressly satirical piece, there's very little contempt for the characters there, right? Rincewind is the protagonist of both The Color of Magic and The Light Fantastic and several other Discworld novels besides. A failed and bumbling wizard from the Unseen University and Ankh-Morpork, even as he is our protagonist, there's very little condemnation of his character or study of his cruelty. Pratchett can really draw out what it is that makes each character unique and each character adorably human, even when we're not dealing with characters who are human, right? We spend a lot of time with death in the course of this book in particular, and we will spend much more time with him as we move through, Hogfather and Reaper Man and some of the later books in the Death miniseries. I think I described them as threads in our first episode, and these stories continue, and we reveal more and more of the humanity of this inhuman, anthropomorphic personification of a universal force, right? Let's get into our reading here as we begin. We jump straight in fact, to what is essentially a recap. It's one of the reasons that I chose the terminal point for our first reading, is that we get a very efficient kind of catch-up as we move into the second reading, and here it is. Days passed, although Mort wasn't certain how many. The gloomy sun of Death's world rolled regularly across the sky, but the visits to mortal space seemed to adhere to no particular system. Nor did Death visit only kings and important battles. Most of the personal visits were to quite ordinary people. Meals were served up by Albert, who smiled to himself a lot and didn't say anything much. Ysabelle kept to her room most of the time, or rode her own pony on the black moors above the cottage. The sight of her, with her hair streaming in the wind, would have been more impressive if she was a better horsewoman, or if the pony had been rather larger, or if her hair was the sort that streams naturally. Some hair has got it, and some hasn't. Hers hadn't. When he wasn't out on what Death referred to as the duty, Mort assisted Albert, or found jobs in the garden or stable, or browsed through Death's extensive library, reading with the speed and omnivorousness common to those who discover the magic of the written word for the first time. Most of the books in the library were biographies, of course. They were unusual in one respect. They were writing themselves. People who had already died obviously filled their books from cover to cover, and those who hadn't been born yet had to put up with blank pages. Those in between, Mort took note, marking the place and counting the extra lines, and estimated that some books were adding paragraphs at the rate of 4 or 5 every day. He didn't recognize the handwriting. And finally, he plucked up his courage. Now, Pratchett is going to repeat this trick many, many times. Pratchett is going to affectionately leverage the reader's knowledge of stories and how they operate in order to set us up for a reversal. Here, of course, we expect, having been introduced to the library, having been introduced to the idea of these self-fulfilling biographies, we might expect, I certainly expected, Mort to go in search of his own book. But he doesn't. Instead, what he does is ask for an afternoon off. He is preoccupied. He has this internal life. And one of the things that I do want to watch as we move through this reading in particular is how Pratchett mediates between our different narrative layers and our different points of view. He's very adept, more adept, as I said back in our first session, more adept than most anyone at navigating between characters and giving us exactly the perspective that we need to witness the story most fully. We're going to get this very clearly later in today's reading as we move into Princess Callie's POV during a crucial event in her life/death. And we witness Mort from the third person. We get the sense of his engagement in the scene, his action in the scene from this relatively distant and uneducated POV. Not that Kelly is generally uneducated, as we learn. She has the finest scholars in the land. But she doesn't know anything about Mort, but crucially we do. And removing us into that distant third person during that sequence, I think, while allowing us to infer what is happening in Mort's head and heart during that sequence, really, really works. We'll talk a little more about that when we get to it. So we've already done the hourglasses and we've already done the biographies. And you'll note that both the hourglasses and the library suggest to us a counterpoint to what is expressly written here on the page, right? Days passed, although Mort wasn't sure how many. The gloomy sun of death's world rolled regularly across the sky. There's this sense of timelessness. There is this sense of being frozen here. We will learn later exactly how that operates, or if not exactly how that operates, the degree to which that is complete, the degree to which this space, that Death's domain, really doesn't experience time in the normal way. And yet, two of the arguably three most important and definitive things about Death's domain, the hourglasses and the library, are clearly very anchored in regular time. They are anchored in the passage of time as it occurs on the disc. The hourglasses don't ebb and flow. There's no sense that there is an inconstancy there or an inconsistency there. They mark the passage of linear time very strictly, which means, I think, that we are led to see in Death's domain contrast and conflict. We are led to see here a kind of balance, in effect, which is frequent as we study this book, as we move through the conflict which is eventually established here. I mentioned this back at the beginning of tonight's session, but it does take a little while, honestly, to get into the core narrative of this particular story, and that's understandable to a certain extent. We've got a lot to establish. We've got a lot of character work to introduce. We could, I'm sure, tighten it up, but perhaps at the loss of some characterization. But though the plot here does take its time to get started, when it is established, it is enormously provocative. That, in fact, we're not quite going to make it all the way through the reading that I predicted for this week. We're not quite going to get to Mort being shot in the back by a crossbow bolt. The last slide that I have pulled tonight is that bravura moment when Pratchett pulls us all the way out of our characterization, or out to this omniscient third-person view, and just lays out the plot, lays out the, or at least the core stakes of what is happening here. So we'll get to all of that at the end of tonight's session. So, in any case, we get the introduction, as I say here, of the library, which write themselves, the books were therein, which write themselves as each life is lived. We get, obviously, also, we're leaning on the idea that stories are powerful, that books are powerful, that we ought to fulfill our role, right? There is a sense of disappointment here that, disappointment is perhaps not even the right word. There is a sense of what? Inadequacy in our portrayal of Ysabelle here, right? The sight with her and her hair streaming in the wind would have been more impressive if she were a better horsewoman, or the horse was larger, or her hair had that streaming quality that some hair does. We're aware of the the reality gap. We can see, we can envision, we can imagine what should be. We know what should be. We know what the Princess Buttercup version of this scene looks like as she gallops across the very crest of the hill, silhouetted perfectly against the evening sky beyond, her hair appropriately streaming. We know what that looks like. We've seen it 1,000 times. But we're here reminded of that gap between what should be and what is. And that is the gap that this entire story is going to operate within. This entire story, and indeed much of the Discworld stories in general, live in that gap between should and is. More on that as we get to it. So as I say, we get this twist here. We are set up for the expectation that Mort is perhaps going to go in search of his own book. Instead, he asks for the afternoon off and goes to Ankh-Morpork. We get the transition here, a first for this particular book, of course, but also a frequent setting for the previous Discworld books and the later ones too. It is in Ankh-Morpork that we meet the City Watch. It is in Ankh-Morpork that Moist von Lipwig tackles the postal service and the banking industry and newspapers. This is where we will do the Phantom of the Opera with the Witch's novel Masquerade and so on. Ankh-Morpork is very fully realized, which means that the familiar reader is already a little worried when Mort winds up in the Shades. 5 minutes later, Mort was lost. This part of Ankh-Morpork was known as the Shades, an inner-city area sorely in need either of governmental help or for preference a flamethrower. It couldn't be called squalid because that would be stretching the word to breaking point. It was beyond squalor and out the other side, where by a sort of Einsteinian reversal it achieved a magnificent horribleness that it wore like an architectural award. It was noisy and sultry and smelled like a cowshed floor. It didn't so much have a neighborhood as an ecology, like a great land-based coral reef. There were the humans, all right, humanoid equivalents of lobsters, squid, shrimps, and so on, and sharks. Mort wandered hopelessly along the winding streets. Anyone hovering at rooftop height would have noticed a certain pattern in the crowds behind him, suggesting a number of men converging nonchalantly on a target, and would rightly have concluded that Mort and his gold had about the same life expectancy as a 3-legged hedgehog on a 6-lane motorway. That motorway reference there, the one that I referred to earlier, that is our moment of Adams-esque, Adamsian flourish there. That is pulling us out of the fiction of the piece to anchor us in our own real-life existence, which, yeah, I think broadly works less well than if he had landed the metaphor in the work of the disc itself. There's another thing here that is introduced that is a very frequent kind of Pratchett concept, the idea of a genuine opposite, right? The idea that the absence of something is not the opposite of something, that dark is not the absence of light. This is already well covered, in fact, in the first Discworld novel, that there is, in fact, something that is the opposite of light. There is a creeping blackness. There is an active darkness that opposes light completely and fully. We will later find out about the opposite of being drunk, that is not, being sober, that rather it passes through being sober into some awful state of absolute and perfect clarity. We'll talk more about that perhaps if we ever return to the disc together. So we get the establishment of the Shades here, and we see how Pratchett is pulling on a kind of Dickensian sense of the squalor of inner London, right? Ankh-Morpork is very much a functional representation of all of the Londons from the Middle Ages up to the Victorian era. I think it's pretty fair to see the city as this blur of wretchedness and refuse, right? Of the great and the good, certainly, but the great and the good living cheek by jowl with the detritus of human society without necessarily othering completely or blaming those people who find themselves in less fortunate circumstances, which we see very clearly when we get into the actual confrontation. I don't love this next slide. I have to pull this next slide because if there is a slide in Mort that is definitive, if there is a fan favorite moment, I think, in this entire book, it is probably this one. If there is a joke that is referenced in the Pratchett community more often than any other from the pages of Mort, I think it is this one. I don't love it, but I do genuinely think I would get complaints if I left it out. So let's have this moment of confrontation. "I don't think I'm due to die," said Mort, backing away. "I'm sure I would have been told." "Yeah," said the thief, who was getting fed up with this. "Yeah, well, you have been, haven't you, great steaming elephant turds?" Mort had just stepped backwards again through a wall. The leading thief glared at the solid stone that had swallowed Mort, and he threw down his knife. "Well, me," he said. "I'm wizard. I hate wizards." "Well, you shouldn't 'em then," muttered one of his henchmen, effortlessly pronouncing a row of dashes. I find a little glottal stop very helpful in the pronunciation of a row of dashes. But again, right, to just draw this comparison once more, this is not a Pratchett joke. This is absolutely an Adams joke. What are we doing with typographical jokes in this book? Again, Pratchett is still experimenting. He hasn't quite pinned down the voice that will become so reliable through, the middle 20 to 25 Discworld novels. He hasn't quite landed at it. So he's in this more experimental mode. And it is here, I think, to answer your question from earlier, Hugh, that we do see the most direct inspiration by Adams. This feels like Pratchett drawing inspiration from Adams far more, I would argue, than really any particular plot point or character detail in his body of work. It's this kind of joke that stands out to me. Elizabeth saying that it did make her laugh. It is a funny joke. It is a funny joke without the dashes, is the thing, right? It is an old joke without the dashes. I won't fill in the profanity for the sake of trying to preserve some kind of PG acceptability here on this podcast. But, it is an old joke that is elevated here by its reliance on, this typographical precision. And also the ambiguity of the moment itself. Why aren't they swearing? These Dickensian street toughs, why are they not just saying the thing that they wanted to say? Which could itself be, I suppose, like a reference to Dickens, right? It could be a reference to the kind of Bowdlerization that we get in the Victorian period, right? As we soften the edges. If you were with me as we read Great Expectations last year, I think that there's a certain amount of that you can see even in that depiction of touching upon a savage underworld. Really, we're leaning on, Oliver Twist here a little more. We're leaning on the idea of that kind of street tough environment, but nonetheless, there's no doubt, right? My reservations aside, there is no doubt that this is one of the most famous and popular Pratchett quotes of all time. At least until you get into his later era and the most popular quotes become actually very profound things about society and the nature of the individual, right? Which we'll certainly get to if we stick with this series. But yeah, for right now, I think this really stands out as an early and frequent favorite. It also introduces this idea, again, right, to highlight this notion, this plausibility gap between what is and what should be. We're highlighting here that Mort can, in fact, walk through walls, but not when he wants to. That there is an inadvertent... It feels very... it feels very X-Men, right? It feels very like Marvel superhero learning the ropes. It feels very origin story in that way, that he can't quite summon it up when he needs to, but inadvertently he can do it. Oh, Elizabeth's quoting here the Samuel Vimes Boots theory of economics, which is my favorite. That is the best bit of writing that Pratchett ever did. As far as I'm concerned, it's up there for the best bit of writing that anyone ever did. It is up there for most astute piece of economic theory that I've ever read in my life. I think it's absolutely incredible. If we return to the disc after we have done Mort, I think I will put my finger on that scale. I will try and set it up so that we can do one of the later Vimes books. I would love so much to do. I mean, Guards is great. Men at Arms is great. All of the Watch books are really good. But for me, it is Thud and it is Night Watch, I think, are so exceptional. Night Watch in particular does a really nice riff on Les Miserables, which I absolutely support. It's a very, very good book. All right, let's keep pushing on here because we still have a long way to go. In fact, we have to go all the way to the Stowe Plains, right? But before we get to there, well, we have this brief beat here. Let me come back to my camera for this because I want to talk a little bit about what happens to Mort on the other side of the wall and our introduction to the Clatchian family. Now, I believe I mentioned back in our first episode that Pratchett didn't want there to be a map of the disc. He believed that filling in the gaps, that actually laying out the geography of the disc would rob it of some of its magic and would certainly prevent him from exercising his usual kind of narrative flexibility in the pursuit of the necessary story for the next book. But maps have been compiled and they struggle with certain elements of the disc, and Clatch is one such element, partly because Clatch is both a country and a continent that contains other countries. It is described variously. It is described using both of those terms. And the fact that it is fundamentally a kind of stand-in that represents everything that the average Englishman, the average Londoner in particular, thinks of as foreign, because Clatch is Turkey and the Near East and the Middle East and North Africa. And as we can see in this excerpt from Mort, it is very explicitly Pakistan and India, right? It is leveraging this vague notion of foreignness in a way that I don't find entirely rewarding, in a way that does give me pause. Although, even here, we see these characters, though they are introduced somewhat stereotypically, though we are leaning on some pretty hoary old tropes for the depiction of foreigners in English comedic material, right? We get the use of language, we get the overblown honorifics used primarily between husband and wife, we get the inclusion of strange gods and strange rituals and strange traditions, right, which aren't completely kosher, right? They're not quite what we expect. For all of that, though they are racialized according to these outdated comedic tropes, Pratchett kind of redeems himself at the end of the scene, I think, as he demonstrates that these characters too possess the same intelligence and wit and scrappy underdog characteristic that we associate with everyone in this world, from Mort to Albert and back again, right? Everyone that we meet has this kind of, or certainly everyone that we meet in Ankh-Morpork kind of has this chip on their shoulder, kind of has this scrappy urban quasi-Dickensian energy, and these characters do too. So though they are initially isolated, though they are initially rendered really quite uncomfortably, I think, there is, in their inclusion within the broader society of Ankh-Morpork, right, a kind of quietly revolutionary idea that being here is the thing that makes you like us, that there is a community. It is, strangely, for all that it kind of hinges on the idea that they are going to flee back to Clatch because the owner of this particular house has sold Mort, the patrician's finest racehorse. For all that there is this idea that their tenure in Ankh-Morpork is coming to an end, there is a kind of pro-immigration message here. It is warm, at least, in a way that other writers perhaps would not have managed quite so successfully. That's a straw man argument, and I shouldn't make that argument, but hey, can you imagine a worse version of this scene? Bet you can. That makes this scene good. That is bad analysis. That is some bad literary theory happening there. But I do see in its last movement at least a partial redemption, or a partial, not redemption, redemption would be the wrong word, a partial inclusion of these characters too within Pratchett's sense of what Ankh-Morpork is. In any case, Mort makes his way across the cabbage-carrying plains of Stowe all the way to Stolat itself. He finds himself then in the company of Igneous Cutwell, a wizard of rather dubious skill. He gets his overblown introduction, and then we get this. "Excuse me," said Mort. "Are you really?" "Really what?" "Master of the thingy, Lord High, what's the name of the sacred dungeons?" Cutwell pushed back his hood with an annoyed flourish. Instead of the grey-bearded mystic Mort had expected, he saw a round, rather plump face, pink and white like a pork pie, which it somewhat resembled in other respects. For example, like most pork pies, it didn't have a beard, and like most pork pies, it looked basically good-humoured. "In a figurative sense," he said. "What does that mean?" "Well, it means no," said Cutwell. "But you said—" "That was advertising," said the wizard. "It's a kind of magic I've been working on. What was it you were wanting? Anyway," he leered suggestively, "a love philter, yes? Something to encourage the young ladies?" Igneous Cutwell, very much drawn from the Pratchett tradition. Even here in Book 4, we have a Pratchett tradition of incompetent wizards with a very overblown sense of their own importance. Formalizing that here, I think, with the idea that not only is this advertising, but that Cutwell is himself trying to invent advertising, that it is a kind of magic, is really good in this moment, and also connects forward to other ideas about psychology and how psychology works on the disc. It's really interesting that at the end of this sequence, we get the brilliant little detail that Cutwell has been swigging idly from Granny Weatherwax's Ramrub Invigorate and Passions Filter, one spoonful only before bed, and that small, right? He's been chugging this alchemical Viagra created by Granny Weatherwax, who is the protagonist, the central protagonist of the Witches series, though. If you know Granny Weatherwax the way I know Granny Weatherwax, you will know that in fact she would not make this kind of potion. This is the reserve of Githa Og, who is Granny Weatherwax's oldest and dearest friend. But there is something really lovely about that balance there, that because Granny Weatherwax will be the one who advocates for this idea of headology later in the series, that the idea that psychology and the telling of stories and the convincing of people is a kind of subtle magic all to itself is really effective, actually. I kind of just, obviously not intentional here, but just really lovely. So again, I do think that we can recognize here a slight deviation from what we might expect in terms of the conventions of plot, right? We do kind of slow down here. I'm not sure that we need, again, to return to Stolat. We are emphasizing, of course, Mort's distraction, his desire to speak again to the princess who saw him, who caught his eye during the, unfortunate circumstances surrounding her father. But this does slow the plot down again, and I think a more experienced Pratchett and perhaps a more skilled editor would have maybe collapsed some of this material so that we don't necessarily repeat ourselves as fully as we do. This is a long way to go for the introduction of Cutwell, who is, after all, a relatively minor character. In any case, we transition out to Mort on his own performing the duty while Death takes an evening off, and we get just a classic, rock-solid 3-beat of exposition. This is so beautifully constructed. I'm a little bit frustrated by it, honestly. I'm just a little bit mad that it is so beautifully put together. We'll begin, of course, with Goody Hamstring, the first person that Mort is going to escort into whatever comes after. And this, of course, subverts our expectation. We've seen the king happen already, right? That's a fairly prosaic, straightforward, not entirely as you might expect, right? Kind of divested of any real religious overtones. And here we see that, in fact, death is a much more complex, a much more theologically varied event, depending on your position in the disc and your knowledge of what will come. The witch stood up, leaving her body behind. "Well done," she said. "I thought you'd missed it for a minute there." Mort leaned against a tree, panting heavily, and watched Goody walk around the log to look at herself. She said critically. "Time has a lot to answer for." She raised her hand and laughed to see the stars through it. Then she changed. Mort had seen this happen before, when the soul realized it was no longer bound by the body's morphic field, but never under such control. Her hair unwound itself from its tight bun, changing color and lengthening. Her body straightened up. Wrinkles dwindled and vanished. Her gray woolen dress moved like the surface of the sea and ended up tracing entirely different and disturbing contours. She looked down, giggled, and changed the dress into something leaf green and clingy. "What do you think, Mort?" she said. Her voice had sounded cracked and quavery before. Now it suggested musk and maple syrup and other things that set Mort's Adam's apple bobbing like a rubber ball on an elastic band. Which is obviously very cute in and of itself, right? A lovely moment of fulfillment for Goody Hamstring the witch. But clearly there's something else happening. There are two things happening here. The first is, again, Pratchett wanting to quantify, to mechanize, to make rational the magic of the disc. We're not just going to, this happens after death as identity becomes blurred across the palette of possibilities available to every soul in the cosmos. No, we get something much more specific here. When the soul is no longer bound by the body's morphic field, right? This is very scientific language. This is very technical language. And we see here, again, Pratchett leveraging exactly that kind of mechanical impulse, not to rob the world of its wonder, not to make this less magical, but rather to establish a rational perspective, a rational mechanism that we might then explore further. We're going to get another example of this in just one moment when we get to the listening monks, right? Which is another perfect example of something very rational being established in the world, something that doesn't even rely upon a metaphor, right? Something that just is clearly, is clearly true is very loaded. Something that could well be very true, right? Something that is established as being true. And then we follow the logical implications. We follow the logical ramifications. And if I can draw one more point of contrast between Pratchett and Adams, I think that it is that. I think that it is Adams' inclination, following in the footsteps of the Cambridge tradition, the Footlights tradition, of the Monty Python tradition, to delve to the deepest absurdity, is here contrasted by Pratchett's desire to delve to the deepest level of rationality, or to, if you prefer, though again, we're making value judgments left and right here, to ascend the heights of rationality, to have an idea and then work out its logical consequences as fully as possible. Later in the series, later in the Discworld series, we're going to see entire books that operate on exactly that principle. And even here in Mort, that gap between what should be and what is reliant on the consequences of the logical system. It's the consequences of the mechanism at the heart of the universe that we're seeing play out here. So I love how this is, obviously, on the one hand, this is just Mort doing the duty by himself and being surprised by it, right? We're going to repeat this with the abbot in just a moment, and then we're going to have our ultimate, 3-beat subversion, right? Establish, explore, or develop, and then subvert is exactly what we get through this sequence. But even here, it is leading into what makes the disc such a special place, what makes Pratchett's work so unique. We must, I'm afraid, accelerate it, though. Mort then moves on. We get the brief note about Cori Celesti here. I'm not even sure. I've never been completely certain how we play with those C sounds. Cori Celesti, I think, does sound better, but obviously, we want it to be Celesti, but then Sorry Celesti doesn't work for me. I don't know. I don't even remember how it is in the audiobooks. For some reason, I've never really got along with the audiobooks for Pratchett's work. I just love the prose on the page, I think, so much. The narrative voice is so clear to me that the audiobooks always feel a little intrusive. They feel like they are not quite the voice that I read these books with, if that makes sense. But in either case, we get our glimpse of the home of the gods, and then the repeated idea here, right, as we get with Goody Hamstring, as we get with the listeners, that the gods of the disc are rather irritable, that they are rather easily provoked, that they don't like human beings who ask too many questions or find out too many things, because there is this sneaking suspicion that right at the heart of their world, right at the heart of their domain, their dominion, right, we have already, by the time that we get to the listeners, separated out the creator figure from the gods of the Discworld, the pantheistic gods of the Discworld. And there is perhaps a sense that the gods themselves are aware that right at the heart of things, there is something deeply silly and embarrassing. There is something that doesn't quite fit together. There is something that doesn't make sense, right? We've touched on this, of course, before. Our first introduction with Mort was establishing this idea that one can try and make sense of the world of the disc, but you can't, because it doesn't, in fact, fundamentally make sense. And again, this is another moment here where the positioning of the gods, the positioning of Death, to a certain extent, though Death is so unique in his character, the positioning of the gods of the disc does inspire me to see a kind of class commentary happening here between the prosaically working class Pratchett and the upper class Adams here. All right, let's, I do want to pull this very short slide for obvious reasons. This, in fact, just codes the whole idea, right? This is the briefest slide that I've pulled for this evening. The theory is quite straightforward. Clearly, nothing that the creator makes could ever be destroyed, which means that the echoes of those first syllables must still be around somewhere, bouncing and rebounding off all the matter in the cosmos, but still audible to a really good listener. This is exactly the principle that I'm talking about here. This is the mechanical element of the fictional universe that is taken as simple fact and then played out to its natural, logical conclusion. Not absurd, but rather kind of wondrous in its ambition and its simplicity simultaneously. There is something very pleasing to the idea that if we accept the precept, if we accept the dogma here that nothing created by the creator can ever truly be destroyed, then those words of creation must still be out there. The fiat lux, the let there be light, must still be audible somewhere in the universe, because that thing itself cannot be destroyed. It's just a perfect example of Pratchett making this kind of rational statement and then following through on it and seeing where it leads. And of course, a lot of this too does tie into Pratchett's real life humanist atheist philosophy. Pratchett was very much predisposed to exactly this kind of series of logical deductions, right? Of inference leading to conclusion, of daisy chaining these thoughts together. If you read his work on environmentalism and environmental protection, you can see a lot of this happening exactly there in a very Discworldy way. When he writes the in-world, when he writes the in-disc universe parts of the Science of the Discworld books, which are, I should maybe just outline the structure of those books if I didn't in our first session. Those books are They are oriented around the Wizards of the Unseen University in Ankh-Morpork creating an experimental round world, that is our world, and then speculating about how a round world might work. So in the first chapter, for example, they create this simulation of this round world, and then the action stops, and actual scientists, science communicators, nonfiction writers, spend a chapter describing the cosmological birth of the Earth and how we arrive, why our planet's round, how does gravity operate, all of these things. So the in-universe bits of Discworld story are knitted very closely with this science communication, which of course is part of Pratchett's own personal employment history when he was working for the electricity network in the Southwest. So we then, at that point, deal with the abbot and with reincarnation. We kind of take this almost self-consciously different approach to what might happen to one after death. It's a pretty cute scene. And again, demonstrates, A, that there is much more in heaven and earth than Mort is aware of, but also that the Discworld is not cosmologically or theologically unitary, right? There isn't a single metaphysical point of arrival. There isn't a single fate that is shared by everyone. There is no single answer to what happens when you die, because we are all involved in the process or the narrative. We are all actors within the world. We are parts of the story because we are also telling the story as we go, which is, if there is a bedrock to Pratchett's metaphysical belief, I think that is it, right? Not necessarily fully in the real world, but certainly within his secondary creation. I think that the idea of, yes, we are telling stories, and yes, it is all stories, and yes, it is exactly that thing that has been repeated by much less talented writers over the years. But the thing that Terry gets to is that we are also telling the stories and also folding the stories and fitting the stories and curving the stories, trying to make the stories what we want them to be, even as we are operating inside of them. But also, the telling of the story doesn't change what you really believe, or it doesn't necessarily change what you really believe. There is a force within you that is in conflict. It is, I don't know. I will hesitate. I will pull this to a pause here and say simply this. I don't know if there's ever been really developed work on Pratchett and his approach to dualism, the Cartesian dualism, the kind of dualism that we just seem to keep talking about here on Stars and Swords. If there is, I want to go and read it. I want to go and figure out, because the tension that he establishes between, not as Descartes did, this sense of self, this cogito ergo sum, and the belief in God, but the belief in oneself and the thing that lies beneath that belief, right? The conscious mind which reflects and judges and chooses, and the subconscious mind that knows damn well how the story is supposed to go. That is so much crunchier, so much more developed, so much more sophisticated than basically anyone who follows in Pratchett's footsteps in that particular regard. Oh no, we're having some technical troubles this evening. I don't think it's my fault, but for once it's not my fault. We had some terrible technical troubles the last time I tried to sit down and do this show, but I think everything is okay for now. Chris, I hope that you can come back on. Too bad. I'm sorry about that. All right. We must, however, push on because, hey, we're coming up on time and we still have some distance to go. We haven't even got to Princess Kelly yet. So, in fact, let's get to Princess Kelly. Let's get to the meat of the matter. Let's get to the third hourglass, which belongs, as I say, to this familiar figure and a slide that I have entitled Mort Buggers It Up. There was a faint metallic sound. Perhaps screaming wouldn't be such a bad idea after all. The window imploded. For an instant, Kelly saw, framed against a hell of blue and purple flames, a hooded figure crouched on the back of the largest horse she had ever seen. There was someone standing by the bed with a knife half raised. In slow motion, she watched fascinated as the arm went up and the horse galloped at glacier speed across the floor. Now the knife was above her, starting its descent, and the horse was rearing and the rider was standing in the stirrups and swinging some sort of weapon, and its blade tore through the slow air with a noise like a finger on the rim of a wet glass. The light vanished. There was a soft thump on the floor, followed by a metallic clatter. Kelly took a deep breath. A hand was briefly laid across her mouth, and a worried voice said, "If you scream, I'll regret it. Please, I'm in enough trouble as it is." Anyone who get that amount of bewildered pleading into their voice was either genuine or such a good actor that they wouldn't have to bother with assassination for a living. She said, "Who are you?" Really great Elizabeth commenting here in the chat. That was nicely written. I love this sequence because, of course, here, as I said earlier, we're pulled all the way out. We're not in Mort's POV for this experience. We've done Mort's POV twice with the abbot and with the witch, and now here we are with the princess, and we are in her POV. She is seeing this unfold, but we're getting these same markers. They're not completely the same. We're evoking the same kind of idea of this blue and purple and black world of ink, right? The same thing that Mort has described, or that we have been described to, we have had described in Mort's POV, but we also get this wonderful, the blade tore through the slow air with a noise like a finger on the rim of a wet glass, which is so brilliantly evocative. That is an absolutely perfect simile right there. Just, you pack up after that. That's it. I don't care what time it is. You write a sentence like that, you just close down your word processor, you go for a walk, you go to the pub, you do whatever the hell you want, because you, friend, have done it. You have hit the goal for the day. It's just perfect. And because we're in that distant POV, again, we don't know what Mort is feeling or doing in this moment, except that we absolutely do, because we know this kid. We know what's happening here. So we get this same emphasis on I suppose a kind of narrative versus reality kind of conflict happening here, right? We know what's happening, even though the aesthetic of the moment, the aesthetic of the scene implies at least more capability, more ability. I'm not entirely sure how we reconcile that all the way down. I'm not entirely sure if this kind of shift in narrative perspective is necessary in this moment. I mean, we can imagine this scene certainly written from Mort's POV as the other scenes have been. We can imagine, I think, a book with a little more discipline when it comes to exactly that kind of perspective trickery, but there is something happening here that I think is very, very powerful. I will note, absolutely, that Mort sucks at the end of this scene. As he is trying to be haughty, as he is trying to assert his authority, as he is trying to leave, he is a jerk. And it's hard to completely disassociate myself from, my natural inclination to support and validate the protagonist of a fantasy novel, right? Like, we all have that a certain amount, right? We don't think that Goldilocks is a terrible person for all of her breaking and entering, right? We just assume that she's a good person because she's the one we're telling the story about. And Mort certainly wins a little bit of that, and certainly wins more of that from me because I read this book when I was, younger than Mort for the first time. So I did kind of imprint on him a little bit, but returning to it now, I am definitely seeing, he's mostly a well-meaning klutz of a kid, but also the bad version of that from time to time, too. So, Mort then checks the book of Kelly's life, an act of rank intrusion, just an absolute shocker of a move, honestly, which the book isn't itself encouraging. And then he goes to confide in Albert. We circle back to that conversation later in the book. We are going to spend a little more time with Albert and figure out exactly what is happening over there. But first we get to the actual grit. We get to the mechanic of what is happening in Stolat and the fulcrum around which the rest of the plot will arc. Here is our slide, as I remove my own image from the bottom corner of the screen so you can see every word of it. Here we are. First, you'd better tell me why I shouldn't send the guards away, she said. Even being in my bedroom could get you tortured to death. She glared at him. Finally, he said, well, could you let my hand free, please? Thank you. Firstly, the guards probably wouldn't see me. Secondly, you'd never find out why I'm here, and you look as though you'd hate not to know. And thirdly what? She said. His mouth opened and shut. Mort wanted to say, thirdly, you're so beautiful, or at least very attractive, or anyway, far more attractive than any girl I've ever met, though, admittedly, I haven't met very many. From this, it will be seen that Mort's innate honesty will never make him a poet. If Mort ever compared a girl to a summer's day, it would be followed by a thoughtful explanation of what day he had in mind and whether it was raining at the time. In the circumstances, it was just as well that he couldn't find his voice. Kelly held up the candle and looked at the window. It was whole. The stone frames were unbroken. Every pane with its stained glass representatives of the Stolat coat of arms was complete. She looked back at Mort. Never mind thirdly, she said. Let's get back to secondly. So I skipped that last slide here. That was obviously a part of the middle of the scene, and I wanted to pull that slide out specifically to talk about exactly that quality of Mort, right? Mort, to whom we are introduced, trying to scare birds in a field and overthinking it somehow, right? Being unable to enter into the reality of the moment because he is distracted by so many other things, including the buried ammonites and fossils and seashells and what have you found in the field, which was what leads us to that description of the creator being fundamentally unreliable in the first place. So I wanted to pull this out just to get to that idea that it is Mort's honesty. That means that he will never be a great poet, for sure. He wants to be clear of the things that he is saying, but it is also that honesty that creates, in part within him, that divide between what is and what should be. What should be is Princess Kelly dies. What should be is that he scares the birds in his father's field. What is that he overthinks these things. What is that he takes the wrong action. Not out of malice or even usually out of selfishness, but rather because he is removed from the world. It's not a complete unity of experience for him. He is not present, as we would say now. All right, let's move on to the, is the actual nut of the matter. This is the crux of the plot here. Kelly, meanwhile, was also finding life difficult. This was because causality had an incredible amount of inertia. Mort's misplaced thrust, driven by anger and desperation and nascent love, had sent it down a new track, but it hadn't noticed yet. He'd kicked the tail of the dinosaur, but it would be some time before the other end realized it was time to say, ouch. Bluntly, the universe knew Kelly was dead, and was therefore rather surprised to find that she hadn't stopped walking and breathing yet. It showed it in little ways. The courtiers who gave her furtive, odd looks during the morning would not have been able to say why the sight of her made them feel strangely uncomfortable. To their acute embarrassment and her annoyance, they found themselves ignoring her or talking in hushed voices. The chamberlain found he'd instructed that the royal standard be flown at half-mast, and for the life of him couldn't explain why. He was gently led off to his bed with a mild nervous affliction after ordering 1,000 yards of black bunting for no apparent reason. The eerie, unreal feeling soon spread throughout the castle. The head coachman ordered the state beer to be brought out again and polished, and then stood in the stable yard and wept into his chamois leather because he couldn't remember why. Servants walked softly along the corridors. The cook had to fight an overpowering urge to prepare simple banquets of cold meat. Dogs howled and then stopped, feeling rather stupid. The 2 black stallions who traditionally pulled the Stolat funeral cortege grew restive in their stalls and nearly kicked a groom to death. In his castle in Stohelet, the Duke waited in vain for a messenger who had in fact set out but had stopped halfway down the street, unable to remember what it was he was supposed to be doing. Through all this, Kelly moved like a solid and increasingly more irritated ghost. So this is exactly what I was talking about before, the idea that though there is a story playing out, we, and as we see here very clearly, everybody, everything is a part of that unfolding story too. We are not separate from the narrative. We are not separate from the cause and effect of the story itself. We are a part of it. We are enmeshed within it. We cannot even see it clearly because it is all around us, right? It is the water. It is the air that we breathe. There's a perfect balance to this as we try to understand how then we exert change. How then do we take action at all? And here we're kind of directly addressing the much larger idea. When I mentioned the library back at the beginning of tonight's show, I didn't highlight the notion that people who have died, well, their books are full. But people who have not been born yet, their pages remain empty until they are. Another example of the actual presence of time itself within death's domain, for all that we're told that time does not touch death's domain as clearly as it should, or as firmly, as traditionally as it should, it in fact absolutely does. So there is a sense here of predestination. There's a sense of the way in which the world is supposed to operate. We are moving through a script that has already been written, a script that is expected, that is anticipated. There is, as we see here, an amount of inertia attached to causality. Things are supposed to play out in the way that they are supposed to play out. And if something happens, if we are diverted from that course, it's not a sudden reset of the timeline. We are going to behave as though the thing that was supposed to happen happens. And you can actually see this, I think, in real life. I think that you can see the actual psychological mechanisms at play here. Obviously heightened here for Pratchett, right? Obviously, we don't really live in this state of reality that is both mutable and immutable simultaneously. We don't have to worry about Death's Apprentice buggering it all up. But there is still, I think, a sense of, if you expect something terrible to happen, and you are invested in the reality of that terrible thing, then it really doesn't matter what the outcome of the specific event is. You're going to have some of those feelings. It's going to feel there's going to be inertia. There's going to be emotional inertia there. And that's without pulling in ideas of, historical inertia and the idea that things which are set in motion are not so easily stopped. I also loved, I didn't pull a slide for this, but I just took the very brief excerpt. Here we get this beat. A couple of maids ran past her without a second glance, giggling. She hurried on, aware that in some strange way she was trespassing in her own castle. And that, she realized, was because it wasn't her castle at all. The noisy world around her with its steaming laundries and chilly stillrooms was its own world. She couldn't own it. Possibly it owned her. Which is a really interesting perspective on Kelly's position. One of the things that distinguishes Pratchett from a lot of traditional fantasy fiction, particularly in the 80s and 90s, I would say, is that he generally stays away from kings and queens. He's not terribly invested in, the rulers. The rulers are usually distant, and what rulers we spend time with, I'm thinking in particular of the patrician of Ankh-Morpork in later books, are unknowable. They are presented as being unknowable. We will someday talk about guards and the things that book has to say about the monarchy and the rule of law. Kelly, in any case, trying to navigate all of this, goes to Cutwell and tries to recruit him, tries to get him on side. We have, let me see here. Yeah, we've only got 3 slides left, so we can definitely push through the rest of these and wrap up this, as I say, somewhat abbreviated second reading. Next week, we will finish the whole rest of the book. I know we have fully half of it to get to, but a lot of this setup is of vital importance. Let's get to Kelly and Cutwell. Kelly stood up. 5 generations ago, one of her ancestors had halted his band of nomadic cutthroats a few miles from the mound of Stolat and had regarded the sleeping city with a peculiarly determined expression that said, "This'll do. Just because you're born in a saddle doesn't mean you have to die in the bloody thing." Strangely enough, many of his distinctive features had, by trick of heredity, been bequeathed to his descendant, accounting for her rather idiosyncratic attractiveness. They were never more apparent than now. Even Cutwell was impressed. When it came to determination, you could have cracked rocks on her jaw. In exactly the same tone of voice that her ancestor had used when he addressed his weary, sweaty followers before the attack, she said, No, I'm not going to accept it. I'm not going to dwindle into some sort of ghost. You're going to help me, wizard." Cutwell's subconscious recognized that tone. It had harmonics in it that made even the woodworms in the floorboards stop what they were doing and stand to attention. It wasn't voicing an opinion. It was saying, "Things will be thus." And isn't that just a kind of storytelling, which raises another bunch of questions, another plethora of questions around that notion of agency. We are all, as we've discussed, enmeshed in the story. The story is active around us. It is carrying on with or without us. And who has the right to tell the story? Who has the authority to tell the story? Who has the actual technical agency? And from where is that agency derived? Because here, yes, Kelly is a princess. That might be the reason that she has the authority. In a more straightforward fantasy book and a fairy tale, that would be the reason that she has the authority. But here, Pratchett very carefully situates the root of that authority, not in the throne of Stolat, not in this temporary arrangement of affairs here out on the Cabbage Plains, but rather in the Mongol inflected, Genghis Khan styled ancestors of Kelly's people, which is, it's very explicit, by the way, if you haven't read the book and you're just listening to the podcast. The connection here with the rampaging Mongols of Genghis Khan is explicit and doesn't fit completely comfortably with the general aesthetic of Stolat, the idea of Kelly as an individual, the way that she is described physically in the course of the book. Like the Clatchian immigrants to Ankh-Morpork that we discussed earlier, we are paddling in a shallow pool of foreignness here, and the lack of desire to reconcile it all doesn't completely excuse it from making little to no sense, honestly. But nonetheless, right, if we divest ourselves of the real world association, if we forget that this is indexing anything that is known to us in real world history, and we accept the metaphor of it, I think the metaphor is extremely powerful. Where does Kelly get this authority? From her blood, because she is descended from people who made exactly this kind of decision. Not because she is descended from kings and queens, but because she is descended from leaders, right? Much more robust and less, constitutionally appointed rulers of their people. All right, we must accelerate. 2 more slides. We have to, of course. Mort tries to tell Death the truth and fails, which is a really great scene just because it's been a few pages since we've had Mort just being a kid, and here he is a kid. Here he is the apprentice again in a way that I really like. It's very effective. We get our first real Ysabelle scene wherein we learn that she has been reading the romantic books in the library in order to experience a kind of romantic life by proxy. There is this sequence of insults traded between the two of them, a kind of badinage, a kind of snarky little golden age of Hollywood meet cute, which I have to say just does not work for me at all. I think that the comedic process there is just outdated, and I think that the reliance on physical insults is just a little flat and doesn't play as well in 2026 as it would have, the better part of 40 years ago. But then we get to the point. Then we get to the actual crux of Ysabelle's character. We get to the thing that makes Ysabelle so interesting, and the thing and fatphobic again, as Elizabeth calls that here in the chat. Yes, again, right? It's exactly that. It feels out of place. But also, I am aware that perhaps I want it to feel out of place because I want to remember a Pratchett that is more evolved than this, that is just better than this. We don't, as I said, his romances are never the strong point, and his female characters, unless they are the focus of the story, are also generally less fully developed than the men. Not badly developed, but just they get less time and attention, unfortunately, unless they are the protagonists, in which case they are generally fully realized and absolutely brilliant. We're going to, someday have the opportunity to talk about the witches, to have the opportunity to talk about Susan Stow-Hewitt. There's a lot of good there, but his incidental female characters are usually a little less complete, and unfortunately Ysabelle is kind of falling into that trap here, along with, you're right, this weird fat phobia, this weird preoccupation with her the characteristics of her pubescence, right? The idea that she is, we're criticizing Callie on the one hand for being too skinny, and we're criticizing Ysabelle on the other for being too buxom, and the quote that we had from last week about pre-Raphaelite not being appropriate because Ysabelle had eaten one too many chocolates. It's all just a little gross, unfortunately, and has aged extremely poorly. This, though, I think has aged really rather well. This is not least of all because, as I say, it has been rerun for us through the prism of Twilight. But this is Ysabelle's confrontation with Mort. "I'm 16, she wailed. "Do you know how long I've been 16 for?" "I'm sorry, I don't No, you wouldn't. No one would." She blew her nose again, and despite her shaking hands, nevertheless carefully tucked the rather damp hanky back up her sleeve. "You're allowed out," she said. "You haven't been here long enough to notice. Time stands still here. Haven't you noticed? Oh, something passes, but it's not real time. He can't create real time." "Oh." When she spoke again, it was in the thin, careful, and above all, brave voice of someone who has pulled themselves together despite overwhelming odds, but might let go again at any moment. "I've been 16 for 35 years. "Oh? It was bad enough the first year." So, living the half-life of a sparkly vampire here in Death's domain, where at least she doesn't have to worry about the sun. What's happening here is very sophisticated. It's very interesting. It speaks to us, I think, of Death's character, right? We get the entire exploration here of this oddly contradictory part of Death. We're told repeatedly that Death doesn't feel, he doesn't have the glands. There is a corporeal necessity that emotion is predicated upon. We have to have the stuff inside of us that generates the chemicals that make us feel things. So we are told, and yet Death is here creating this garden for Ysabelle, adopting Ysabelle in the first place, coming to whatever secret arrangement he has with Albert, which we will get to in due course, having feelings about Binky the horse, having feelings about the sack of cats being drowned in Ankh-Morpork, wanting to murder a curry, for example. Here we are seeing a Death that evidently has feelings, evidently has deep and compelling feelings that force him into action, that force him into acts of this this copied creativity, right? And if you've been with me through my discussions of the works of J.R.R. Tolkien, of course, you'll recognize some aspects of this. There is a kind of Melkorian aspect to death that he can't really create. He can only copy. He can only subvert. He can draw in these elements from elsewhere, but he doesn't have the flame imperishable, right? He doesn't have the power of actual, authentic creativity himself. Because why should he? Because why does death need to create at all, right? There isn't a quality here that is fundamentally inconsistent. If we take death at the surface level, that he is the Grim Reaper, that he is the anthropomorphic personification of death itself, he has no need of creativity. So he has substituted this false creativity for the real thing because it fulfills a need, and that need is present because he feels its presence. And even as he's reaching out in kindness, whether it's to give Ysabelle a home, or it's to create the fountain to please her, or it's to bring Mort in as an apprentice, we're doing already the nudge, nudge, wink, wink, someday my son, all of this will be yours stuff, right? Death is aware of the story that's supposed to be unfolding too, and also lacks the agency to force that story along. He's trying to cultivate it, but he can't really do it. More on that as we move through the rest of the book. Okay, this is our last slide. We're going to be focusing again. This is the moment that I mentioned earlier, right? This is Pratchett pulling all the way back and just actually laying out the stakes for us. This is what is happening, we are told. In fact, we are literally told this is what is happening. Let's get to the slide. Mort thought that history was thrashing around like a steel hawser with the tension off, twanging backwards and forwards across reality in great destructive sweeps. History isn't like that. History unravels gently like an old sweater. It has been patched and darned many times, reknitted to suit different people, shoved in a box under the sink of censorship to be cut up for the dusters of propaganda, yet it always, eventually, manages to spring back into its old familiar shape. History has a habit of changing the people who think they are changing it. History always has a few tricks up its frayed sleeve. It has been around a long time. This is what was happening. The misplaced stroke of Mort's scythe had cut history into two separate realities. In the city of Stolat, Princess Callie still ruled, with a certain amount of difficulty and with the full-time aid of the royal recognizer, who was put on the court payroll and charged with the duty of remembering that she existed. In the lands outside, though, beyond the plain and the ramtops, around the Circle Sea, all the way to the rim, the traditional reality still held sway, and she was quite definitely dead. The Duke was king, and the world was proceeding sedately according to plan, whatever that was. The point is that both realities were true. The sort of historical event horizon was currently around 20 miles from the city and wasn't yet very noticeable. That's because call it the difference in historical pressures, wasn't yet very great. But it was growing. Out in the damp cabbage fields, there was a shimmer in the air and a faint sizzle like frying grasshoppers. People don't alter history any more than the birds alter the sky. They just make brief patterns in it, inch by inch, implacable as a glacier and far colder. The real reality was grinding back towards Stolat. That's the stakes. That's what we're doing. That's the plot of the story, or at least the terminal construction of this particular story. And again, you'll see everything that we've been discussing here, right? The idea of is and should be, the pressure of should be, the reality shear between what is and what should be is now closing in on Stolat. That pressure is only growing, which is such a brilliantly evocative, fantastically imaginative, and yet completely understandable, completely comprehensible metaphor from Pratchett here. The dome around Stolat is closing in because the history of the pressure that should be is tightening around Callie and Cutwell and the castle itself. Obviously, this is going to play out over the rest of the book, which we will cover in next week's session. Here I am, already after time, and we will get out of here as quickly as ever we may. Next week, April 28th, I do apologize, by the way, for the slight rescheduling. Last week was just a disaster, and I could not make a live session happen. But look, here we are. The Patreon-exclusive bonus episode, which you can find over at patreon.com/nextword, called Made It Through Monday, was recorded on Monday. Here I am on my regular Tuesday schedule, right here with you all. We're back, baby. We're back. Everything's going to be just fine from now on. I have the agency to control the story. I guarantee it. Wow, that is really just asking for trouble, isn't it? I'm genuinely a little bit surprised that my computer did not just catch fire as I said those words, but we can tempt fate, at least. All right, so April 28th, next Tuesday night, Shire Reckoning, Baron and Luthien, Part 1, something like the first 100 pages of the standard hardback. I'm not going to be too strict about that. I want to take our time a little bit, particularly as we're moving through the first part of that story. I will also probably reference the version that we get in the Silmarillion to give us a grounding as we move into the Baron and Luthien story. But we're going to be spending a few weeks thinking about masculinity and femininity in Tolkien and beyond. We're going to be thinking about courtly love, romantic love, erotic love. We're going to be thinking about the ways in which men and women make relationships, discover relationships, forge relationships in Tolkien's Legendarium. And we're going to be thinking absolutely about the role of mortal men and immortal elves within the span of, particularly here, the first age of Tolkien's Legendarium. Then, May 5th, we will be back. Stars and Swords, Mort, Part 3. My intention is to finish up. My intention is to cover the last half of the book in a usual length episode. So we'll see how that works out. It might be slightly longer than usual. We'll see. But having established here, having got to, just before the midpoint of the book, I suppose, we have established our cast of characters. We have set up the conflicts. We have a sense of where these two diverging stories are going now, and these two diverging realities and how they are coming into contact, the one with the other. So that, I think, will expedite things as we move through the very end of our discussion. This has been such an absolute pleasure. I mentioned, I think, last week, if not the week before, that this is my first time ever talking about Pratchett in this mode, to take this scholarly analytical approach to Pratchett. And I have realized that Mort is much less finished than I thought it was. It's much less complete than I thought it was. Still a damn sight better than the 3 books that preceded it in terms of fully giving voice to Pratchett's real vision, his the ultimate product of his genius. But for all of that, there's so much good here. There's so much power here. The narrative story is so much more thoughtful and complex and challenging and provocative than, as I say, any of the host of imitators of this book and of Pratchett's work in general. I'm more excited than ever, really, to talk someday soon about my other favorite British comic writer, Jasper Fforde, and to dig into some of that. But we'll have the opportunity to do that, I'm sure, in the months, if not the years to come. Thank you so much for listening tonight. Chris, I'm very sorry for your VPN troubles. I hope that you will enjoy the podcast version of this episode afterwards. I am somewhat relieved that it wasn't my fault this week. I am somewhat relieved that everything seems to be still operating despite me tempting fate mere moments ago. That's going to do it for this week's episode of Stars and Swords. Thank you guys so much for listening. Thank you so much for your support. I will talk to you all again next week. Until then, do please take care. Good night, all.